Welcome to Season 4 of the Hope Warrior Project podcast, where we are ditching the mindset of powerlessness. Our guests have let go of the belief that life is happening to them and have chosen to see that life is actually happening for them. If you want to get inspired and empowered in your own life, these are the stories you want to hear.
Today's guest and Hope Warrior is Terri Kozlowski. At 11 years old, she and her sister went to Albuquerque to spend the summer with their mother. That trip changed Terri's life and personality drastically. At this point, her mother was addicted to drugs, and she allowed terrible things to happen to Terri and her sister in order to get free drugs. She then disappeared for a few days while Terri was left to take care of her comatose sister. When her mother returned, she handed Terri and her sister their suitcases and left them alone on the streets of Albuquerque. This was no doubt a very traumatic experience and negatively affected Terri for a long time. Over the years, she learned to change her mindset from victim to survivor and empowered herself by releasing the past. I'll hand it over to Stephanie for the conversation with Terri, where she shares how she was able to heal and release her past. And I'll be back with you in a bit to unpack the powerful takeaways.
Hello, Hope Warriors. Welcome back to the show. As you have just heard, we have quite the story to share with you today. Terri, thank you so much for being my guest.
You're welcome, Stephanie. I'm glad to be here to be with your audience.
Awesome. And we were just chatting right before this started. Terri, I know you've done several podcasts, and I was actually just listening to you on another podcast right before we started. So a lot of really great insight that you have on a variety of topics. But today we really want to focus in on this idea of the trauma that you experienced and then how, through time, you found power in releasing the past. So, for myself, thinking about what you went through, hearing that story, help us understand kind of what went through your mind when your own mother was allowing these things to happen to you and your sister.
I don't think that I understood any of it, but what I do know is that all children are very aware. And I was an extremely aware child when I was younger. And I believe that all children come into this world knowing who they authentically are and know what their purpose is. And yet us loving parents squash that because we want them to be good girls and good boys. And we teach them how to start conforming to what we desire. And then peer pressure sets in and they're conforming to what their friends want. And then we end up in midlife crises and wondering why we're being something we're not really meant to be. But for me, my awareness at the time was something that I found as a blessing, because there were things that occurred and happened that if I wasn't aware, I don't think I would have gotten out of there alive. For example, there was a gentleman who picked us up at the, when we got there into New Mexico, that picked us up with my mother. My mother didn't have a vehicle, so he drove to pick us up. And when he took us to Sandia Peak, we had a lovely dinner, and he was a nuclear physicist at Los Alamos. I have no idea how in the world he knew my mother, who was a drug addict and an alcoholic at this point. And when he took us to my mother's one-bedroom efficiency apartment, he handed me his business card. Now, if as an adult, handing an 11-year-old child a business card doesn't seem to make any sense. And it didn't. I never had been given a business card before. But he said, if you need anything, please call me. Whatever you need, I will take care of. And I kept it for some reason. I knew this would be important. And then after all the trauma occurred and I'm trying to figure out how to get home, and I call my dad and tell him, we need to come home now. He asked me if I had a ride to the airport. And I remembered Alan. He had a cowboy hat on and cowboy boots. I just remember, and he was not much taller than my mother. My mother's only like 5'11". So he wasn't a tall man. And all I remember was this cowboy, and said, yes, I have a ride to the airport. Didn't talk to Alan. And when I got off the phone with my dad, I called Alan, and Alan was there the next morning, an hour ahead of schedule, to pick us up, walked my sister and I onto the airplane to make sure we were seated and we were okay. And I've never seen or heard from Alan again. So this is where the awareness that I know I had when I knew Alan was important for my life. I knew Alan was an angel sent to me to make sure that my sister and I got home safely. And when you're aware, other things happen. For example, when I got off the airplane, and my sister's running to my dad's arms, she's so thankful we're home. And I walked to him carrying my suitcase and say, I need therapy.
Mm.
And that's something where I knew I needed help. And I knew asking for help wasn't going to be a negative in my life. It wasn't showing that I was weak. When you ask for help, it's a sign of strength, because only when you can reach out and say, hey, something bad happened, I need help with this, can you get the help you actually need. As an 11-year-old, I didn't have the language. I didn't have the maturity. I didn't have the understanding of what in the world happened. And it would take pretty much a good 5 years before I truly understood all the things that actually happened. Because the remembering that my mother was in the room, I didn't remember for 3 years after we returned. My mind knew that I couldn't handle it at that moment in time. And 3 years into therapy is when I remembered that she was in the room watching the whole thing. Because if your mother isn't going to protect you, if your mother's going to put you in harm's way, if your mother's going to sell your innocence so that she could have drugs, who in the world's going to protect you?
Right.
So I shifted into a state of constant fear. Everybody was out to get me, because if your mother is not going to help you, who is? And because of that underlying fear and everything, I didn't trust anybody, and I went into myself. And then I stayed there for a very, very long time, because being alone means nobody can get to you, and nobody can hurt you, and nobody can harm you. So although, and the strange and horrible thing about that is, then we get lonely, then we feel alone. And that's what the ego does. The egoic mind has one job, and that is to protect us. And my ego went into overdrive, and it did an excellent job at trying to protect me. And it tried to do that for decades. And through that process, understanding that the ego was doing what it could to keep me isolated so that I wouldn't get harmed. But in isolation, we also can't heal.
Right. And it's interesting when you were saying, like, you're trying to protect yourself, right, by kind of withdrawing, not trusting people, but then what we end up doing is actually hurting ourselves. It's just in a different way, right? It makes sense what you're trying to do, especially something traumatic like that happened and being so young. I mean, what else do you know to do? And I think sometimes that's just even like a subconscious response we have to the traumatic experience like that. But going back to, at when this happened, and the guy giving you the business card and you thinking, I should hold on to this. The funny thing that stood out to me is like, okay, well, you're not supposed to talk to strangers, right? Now, granted, he was with your mom, but otherwise you didn't know this guy, right? And he's giving you a business card, which could be like, this is really weird. Why is this guy giving me a business card? But like you said, he ended up being like the angel that you needed to save you from that situation, which was just such a really cool experience. And to look back on that, and the fact that you thought, yeah, I need to keep this business card and reach out to this guy to help us get back to the airport. Wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And the awareness that you needed therapy. I know when we had talked prior to this, I don't know how many 11-year-olds would know that or think that I need therapy. So, I mean, there was definitely some pretty cool, awareness and maturity there that you even realized that and didn't feel bad about it. Even as adults, I think we can sometimes feel bad, like we need therapy, right? It's just,
most of us don't like to admit that we need help.
Right.
Now, just asking for help, asking a coworker for help can be, something that we really try not to do. And the reality is, I am good at what I do, and you are good at what you do, but I'm not good at the same things you are. So if I collaborate with you, we're going to be better together. And that's part of the egoic mind, thinking that it's trying to protect us and trying to, bolster our self-esteem and all that, when the reality is we need human connections. We need each other, and together we accomplish more than we do separately. And that's why the whole idea of I need help is really a sign of strength.
And it goes back to what you were saying about how, as a child, you're taught, to be good, to behave in certain ways, etc. It's like this cultural normalization, right, we go through, that same thing happens at work. I mean, then we could go off on a
Mm-hmm.
whole nother subject there about like, why
Mm-hmm.
do we feel like we don't need help? Well, because I'm being evaluated on my performance at the end of the year, and my raise or my bonus is going to be dependent upon what I did. And I think the whole, corporate structure lends to that and kind of pushes people into that mindset as well. But in reality, it's not just about one person. Just like you said, we don't all know everything. We need the help of others.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so much of society wants us to compete against each other.
Yes.
And I'm not in competition with anybody except this person I was yesterday.
Mhm.
Today's goal is to be better than the person I was yesterday. I'm not competing against you. I'm not competing against anybody. And as if we go into the idea that we are part of the whole, and whatever is best for the whole is best for me too, then we collaborate instead of compete.
Exactly. And we're talking about, kind of the theme of this episode is this idea of there's power in releasing the past. And there's power in releasing these ideas that we have held on to or somehow been trained to think in our minds, that there's power in that as well. But so let's then go further with your story. So you get home, you say, I need therapy. You go to therapy, but you have this reaction. You're not trusting people. You're withdrawing. What caused you then to decide to change that mindset from, this victim mentality to survivor? What caused that?
So when I got to college, I had a friend, and I don't even remember his name. I know that he was a medical person he thought he was going to be a doctor. I don't ever think he made it, but that's what he was going undergrad work. And only time I spent with him was in the lunch area, and we would talk. And I'm one of those people that I'm very open about my trauma. Now, I may not give you all the details, but at the time, there were lots of things that triggered me. So I didn't want to have a bad reaction to something you did because that's on me. I knew that I had triggers. So I would share that I had a traumatic experience and certain things not to do. Don't come up behind me and tap me on the shoulder because I'm going to come around and try to punch you. So don't do those things and we'll be fine. So I was open about that. And he and I kept talking over a course of a couple weeks. And then one day he said to me, "You like being a victim." And I got very angry. And I'm like, who are you to tell me anything about my victimhood? But how he said it was kind and compassionate. He wasn't trying to upset me. He was trying to get me to see something else. So I sat with that for a while. I journaled about it. And what I came to realize was I was getting something out of playing the victim. As long as I stayed in victimhood, everybody did leave me alone. They treated me different. They were gentler with me because they didn't want to trigger me. So if they didn't know what to say, they said nothing. So my ultimate goal, which was to be left alone, was happening, but it was happening from a negative perspective. So I had all this other negativity that was happening with me being left alone because now they're whispering about me. Oh, you don't want to do that, all this stuff. So I didn't need that. I needed support. So I decided that there had to be a better way for me to communicate. And the one thing that us humans don't necessarily do well all the time is communicate authentically with one another. And I figured there had to be a better way for me to communicate my desire to be left alone. So I decided that day that I was changing from a victim to survivor. And in doing so, two things happened. Number one, I was now responsible for my behavior, and I was responsible for the choices I made. Whether they were good or bad, right or wrong, if I fell flat on my face, whatever it was, those were my decisions, my choices. I was taking responsibility, which means I couldn't blame my mother. I couldn't blame the past. I couldn't make excuses. Oh, well, I was sexually assaulted. I couldn't do any of that and still maintain responsibility for the choices I made. Because when you take responsibility, a second thing, an amazing thing happens to trauma survivors when they take responsibility. And that second thing is empowerment. We get back our power. We take control again of our lives moving forward. Yes, the past sucked. Yes, we had trauma. Yes, it was negative. But moving forward, I get to choose who I become. I get to choose what happens. Not my mother, not the 3 men who molested me. Those people have no say in my present or my future. And that's the second thing that happens when you become a survivor. You find that empowerment, because that is the one thing that most trauma survivors, a lot of people just in general, whether you have trauma or not, want control of their lives. And the only way to have control of your lives is to take responsibility for your choices and actions.
That is so hard too, man. Seriously, I was just having a conversation with someone, and the conversation came around to this idea of, even I was talking about something that I didn't like that was happening in my life, and he's like, so you want to control it? I'm like, yeah. And when he said that, I'm like, shoot, I can't. Like, it just, sometimes we just need someone to say it. And it was like you just said, this friend said this in a very kind, compassionate way.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way it happened to me just this morning. And I was like, oh man, you're right. And I didn't even look at it that way. But I actually want to ask about that too, because you said you found benefits in kind of staying in this victim mode, right? Did you also realize like the cons to that, the negativity of that? Were you kind of cognizant of that, or were you more just kind of focused on like, this is a good thing, this is helping me?
When we put defense mechanism in place, we only ever see the benefits. It's only when we become aware that there could be a downside to it that we actually see what those defense mechanisms, the negativity they're causing. All defense mechanisms work for a period of time. They do not work forever. Let me repeat that. Defense mechanisms do not work forever. At some point, they become hindrances to our growth, hindrances to our expansion, hindrances to us becoming our full authentic selves. Because what a defense mechanism is, another word for it, is a mask. We're hiding behind something. We're not being our authentic selves. Or it's armor. I armored up. I was really armored up, and nobody got in unless I let you in. And even if I did let you in, you didn't get in very far. So you could be standing in the doorway, but you may have never gotten through the doorway. So because of that, the authentic me that was way behind those walls, nobody saw. Nobody saw that. And that is who we need to be to truly come to the other side of our healing. And that's what any spiritual journey is. That's what any healing journey is all about, becoming our authentic selves.
So now that you can look back on this, right? You're aware now. What would you say were the negatives about keeping yourself safe? And the reason I'm asking is because maybe could be someone listening that is maybe not at that point yet where they've realized that they've got these defense mechanisms in place, they're protecting themselves, and maybe they're not seeing the negativity. So I'm just curious, if talk about now looking back, what was that doing for you in a negative way?
It kept me isolated. So that, do I think that if I had more people loving on me and being supportive of me, that it would have taken less time? Absolutely. When you isolate yourself and you feel like you have to do everything and there's nobody there in the world that's going to support you, it makes it very difficult to move forward with your life. You stay stuck. The other thing that it did was it kept me in scarcity mode. It kept me in fear mode. And all of that got me to the place where I was never going to grow.
And it is important. And thank you for sharing too, like in the looking back, how you now can see the way this was holding you back in life. And I think when we can look at it from a logical standpoint, that's not good for us. Like you said, you can't grow if you are not allowing yourself to be in community. You're not allowing yourself to like even maybe acknowledge what you really think or who you really are. So then how are you supposed to live out your life? So thank you for sharing that. And I can connect with some of that as well. And to be honest, I feel like probably everyone can connect to that on some level if we're honest with ourselves. So, and you talked a little bit about the egoic mind, and we've talked about this at Hope Warrior before. And our stinking little ego, big ego, I guess, can really cause us some trouble. So talk about that and how that would come up for you throughout in this keeping you safe, or even, even today. Like, does that still like kind of come up for you? And then how do you address it? Because I don't think our ego ever really goes away.
It doesn't come up for me. So let me say that it's not that the ego doesn't go away. Mm-hmm. It's that I know that voice, and I know whether or not I should, I know I shouldn't listen to it, is basically what it comes down to. So that for me, the way I explain the ego is that its job is to protect us. And in our past, in our history, anything that caused us great harm becomes this giant thing that it's trying to protect us from for the rest of our lives. So my ego has been trying to protect me from sexual harm and abandonment for over 40 years now. It's done a really good job, and it kept me from going back to New Mexico for over 25 years. Okay. So it does its job for a reason, and we have to understand what that reason is. So through my healing journey, there were significant things that I realized along the way that were good and that were bad, and things I had to learn, things I had to unlearn, things I had to let go of, things I had to forgive. All those things along our journey help us get to the place where when the ego is loud and obnoxious and screaming at us, that's normally not the thing to listen to. Mm-hmm. And that's how you can tell, is this my ego or is this my heart? The heart and soul are going to whisper to you, and you have to get quiet. That's why everybody recommends journaling or meditation or prayer. That those quiet moments is when and only then can you actually hear your heart and soul speak to you. So if I have angst about something, if my ego is ranting and raving and screaming, then I listen and then I go journal or I go meditate, because I know that if I get quiet, the truth for me will rise. Yeah. And I will have the answer that I need for me. Mm-hmm. Now, my answers may not be your answers, mm-hmm. because we are all different people, and what's true for me may not be true for you. But understanding that the method to get there, the method to find out is the same. Mm-hmm. You can find out the whispers of your own heart and soul by getting quiet. Whether you do it through meditation, journaling, prayer, however you need to do it, walking in the woods. Walking in the woods saved my life during my teenage years. Wow. Absolutely saved my life. Most people who have gone through sexual trauma all deal with suicidal thoughts. And I spent a good portion of my teenage years walking in the woods, making sure I wasn't going to hurt myself. Mm-hmm. And, those things that come up for us because of the why me question. Why me is absolutely the worst question anybody can ever ask themselves, because it doesn't get you to a resolution. Mm-hmm. It keeps you stuck and focused on the past. Right. And I spent, up until my mother passed, which was not until 2012, looking for the why me question. And what's really strange is after she passed, I realized even if she gave me an answer of why it all happened, there's nothing that she could have said that would have justified her behavior. Mm-hmm. So if I wasn't ever going to accept her reasoning for why me, mm-hmm. then why does the why me matter? Mm-hmm. The why me matters to the ego, because the ego wants us to remember our trauma. The ego wants us to remember and stay tied to the past so it never happens again in the future. And that's understandable, but we need to change the question. And the new question we need to ask ourselves is, now what? Yes, all this happened. Yes, this was all bad, but now what? Now what am I going to do? That is when, am I going to stay a victim? Am I going to live out my life in victimhood?
And I think when you stay in the why me, there's probably, in a situation where someone's done something to you, that also probably doesn't allow you to get to the point where you're able to, kind of forgive that person. And that's that even just sounds really like hard to even say in the situation that you went through. But I know you said you did get to the point where you were able to forgive your mom. So talk about that. How did you get to that point? What was that like?
So that I did not get there before I got rid of the why me question. Okay. So you can forgive without going to now what? Now, I did switch from victimhood to survivorship before I was able to forgive. But forgiveness, the meaning of behind forgiveness gets lost on people who are traumatized. It gets lost on people who are in their heads thinking that they are giving absolution to something horrible that's happened. And that's not what forgiveness is about. Forgiveness is saying, I am worth more to myself than that other person who harmed me is. And that means that I am willing to forgive and release that negativity out of me so that I can move forward. So forgiveness is never about the other person. It's always about us and our attachment to them, that anchor that holds us to them. We're finally saying, hey, I'm going to release the anchor. I'm moving forward. I'm rising up because I'm not anchored to you anymore. I'm now detaching myself from you and the negativity so that I can live the life that I'm supposed to live.
Yeah. Such an interesting concept, because I think when growing up, and maybe most of us, when you think about forgiving, it kind of comes to mind that you're saying, well, it's okay. It's okay what you did. I forgive you. But that's not really, I mean, right? Like, obviously you're not going to say that it was okay,
Right.
what your mom let happen, but that doesn't mean you can't forgive her. And to release that from yourself, that burden that you're carrying is what really is what's helpful. And I think it's a real shift in the way we think about what forgiveness is, because I never really thought of it that way until just maybe in the last year or two, and hearing stories like yours and people that have gotten to the point where they are able to forgive something that would seem to be unforgivable.
The other thing for me is that it happened in stages. So because although I didn't see my mother for long period, years, decades, I didn't see my mother, but we would communicate via the telephone, and she would call me up drunk, and I would listen to her berate me, and everything in her life that was wrong was my fault. And for years, I took all this in. And finally, in my early 30s, I put up the first personal boundary with my mother, which was I let her know that I would talk to her if she wasn't drunk. But if she was drunk, I wasn't going to speak to her. And I would hang up the phone and unplug it from the wall, because that's when it still was plugged into the wall. And the first time I did it, I shrunk to the ground crying, because in the back of my head, I'm hearing, honor thy mother and father, honor thy mother and thy father. And I was raised in a Christian environment where that was very important. And it was after, before I did this, that I heard somebody in the church tell me, honoring thy mother and thy father does not mean you allow them to hurt you. And it was after I realized, oh, there's qualifiers here. And, logically, it makes sense that to honor others doesn't mean you allow them to hurt you. But when you are a child and the people that are hurting you are family, and this is, I don't want to say normal, but this is what I've experienced, so I don't know any different. The idea that they're not supposed to hurt me was new. And it took me about 1.5 years before I really felt, okay, I can try to do this. And when I did it, I still crumbled to the ground crying. And, but, after 2 or 3 times, she quit calling me drunk.
Yeah.
So, it's about standing your ground, and standing your ground's hard. Standing your ground is hard because that egoic voice comes into your head. What are you doing? She's your mother. And, but finally, personal boundaries are something that we put in place for us as an act of love and self-care. And that's the other aspect of personal boundaries that we don't get told, because most of us aren't even taught what a personal boundary is. That's not part of, growing up in family. This is a personal boundary, and this is or something we get taught in school. I don't think I actually knew what a personal boundary was until I read Codependent No More, which I did when I was pregnant, because I wasn't going to pass on my codependency to my child. And it obviously I needed time to work that out because I didn't give birth for 10 months. From the time I found out until he came was 10 months. So I needed that extra month to work through this. But I was, I didn't understand what a personal boundary was. And most people hear the word and they think they know what it is. But the reality is it's really, really hard to set personal boundaries when you're a people pleaser.
Yes.
Because you want that positive attention from people. Or if you really just have no concept that other people harming you isn't okay.
Right. Yeah. And I think probably, especially maybe as little girls, we're taught, just be nice, just get along.
Mm-hmm.
Don't fight, don't create waves, just be nice. And that can override any idea of setting boundaries, because if
Correct.
I set a boundary, then that I'm not being nice. I'm not, that person's going to be upset with me. I'm going to hurt them. And then what's going to happen? And I'm going to look like this horrible person. And yeah, so a lot of it, we just learn it as a very young children, and it just stays with us, and it just gets further and further ingrained. I think until we're able to hear, stories like yours and be able to see and challenge that thought, right? We got to challenge the thought. Some of them may be still right for us,
Mm-hmm.
but there are probably quite a few that aren't necessarily right at all, or maybe right for us. And so, allowing ourselves to do that, to challenge it and question it and, ponder on it and think about it. Yeah. So today, you've talked about, you've gone through this process, you found this, this safe relationship, you've gone through the therapy, you've been able to forgive, taking the responsibility. So life has changed, right? From what it was up to, 28 or whatever. Can you give an example today of how this all has helped you? How do you see that what you've been through, even the trauma, how has that worked for you in your life today to help you?
A really simple example is that I am a recovering control freak. You mentioned control, so I thought maybe that would be a good one to bring up. And to the point where at some point, I think it was almost OCD, because in my first marriage, if my my ex-husband would get up in the middle of the night, have a glass of milk and rinse it out and put it upside down in the sink. Mm-hmm. And I would wake up when I heard it clinking to the metal sink, because he didn't put it in the dishwasher. And I would get up in the middle of the night and go put it in the dishwasher.
Oh my goodness.
So, because I had to have my house just so, because for some reason, I believe that if the outside looked good, my inside would look good. And that really isn't the case. Mm-hmm. And so, although my family still thinks that I'm very controlling, I just have everything in its place now, and I know where it goes. Yeah. But in the business world, I'm extremely well organized, and that's a benefit to the company I work for. So depending on how you're using it, depends on if it's good or bad, and whether it's harming us or helping us. So I don't think that there's really anything that is really, really bad or really, really good. It's just, how are we using it? Being organized. If it's an idea, if I'm organized and I'm in control of my environment, the reality is we control a very, very little. What we can control is only what we do. We can't control anybody else. We can't control how anybody else feels. We can't control how my words affect your audience, because everybody's different. Right. So the idea is, be authentically you, speak from your heart, and let the chips fall where they may, and we'll all work it out together. But the idea of making sure that we understand that the past isn't who I am. I choose who I become. And people get stuck in thinking that their trauma is who they are. They identify with that victimology. And that's not ever how we're supposed to be. We're supposed to grow. We're supposed to expand and become our full authentic selves. And I think that's what all midlife crises are, is that at some point we get really, really frustrated with wearing the masks and armor and playing the roles and taking on the labels others have put upon us, and say, I'm done. Yeah. And we do something drastic to try to really say, I'm tired of this. I'm exhausted from being something I am not. I don't like who I am. I want to be me. And I think really that's what midlife crises are.
So a midlife crisis can actually be a good thing, is what I'm hearing. All right.
Absolutely. Because if you think about those people that have had a midlife crisis and you see them on the other side of it, not going through it, but on the other side of it, they are much more joyous. They're much more peaceful. They're happy people because they've taken off all the masks.
Yeah. Just as you were talking through all that, I thought, life is just a constant learning process.
Mm-hmm.
And if we will allow ourselves, to learn from it, it's probably a little bit easier. I mean, learning is not easy usually, but when we fight it, it's even harder. And then we have to keep going through something over and over again until, we finally learn it. So you've just kind of just demonstrated how that's kind of happened throughout your life and the various things that have moved and shifted in your life. It's been learning.
That's part of releasing the past, is you have to learn not so much why it happened, but learn what lesson it is you're supposed to gain from it. Our life doesn't happen to us. We experience our life, and we're supposed to learn something from each and every experience. We're supposed to understand that the people that come into our lives are there for a reason, whether they're there to help us or we're there to help them.
Yeah.
Whatever that lesson is supposed to be. So we need to learn how to recognize that our experiences are meant for our growth. Yeah. And only when we release the past is it the process of learning. We have to understand that there's a lesson here. What lesson am I to take? And as soon as you learn or realize what that lesson is, the past fades away.
Yeah. Well, that was a perfect wrap up to this conversation. I mean, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. I could not set it up better myself.
Hey, Hope Warriors, it's Lydia again. That was a ton of information. I love how clear Terri is on her story and what she needs to do to keep healing and living as her authentic self. There is so much wisdom in this interview, so I am here to pull out some of the key concepts. She starts off by talking about how we are all born very aware. I agree. However, we're also born completely helpless. What I mean by this is that if a baby is born and left without care, it won't survive. I find it so amazing that we are probably one of the most helpless species when we're born, but overall the most advanced by far. Some animals are born walking. Some are abandoned by their mothers before they even hatch, and they somehow find their way. There is no doubt about it. We need other people. And with that comes domestication, which is our way of making sense of the world. We look to others to see how we should be. The problem with that is that it can lead to building a life that does not feel authentic to our own truth. And that's the truth that we're born with. That's what Terri's referring to as being aware as a child, which then plays into this idea of the midlife crisis. And I love that she brings up the midlife crisis. I picture a balding man going out and buying a sports car convertible, but I think she sheds a light on what is actually happening when someone starts to realize that they have been living according to what other people have wanted for them instead of the life that they would authentically want for themselves. It can be a messy process, but it's a very important one, and it looks different for everyone. I connected to this because I have been referring to my lowest point as my quarter life crisis since it happened to me in my 20s. I think it was probably be better described as an identity crisis, and I think that it's happening a lot sooner for my generation and generations to follow. With technology and overall evolution, I believe that the disconnect is felt even sooner, which I'm incredibly grateful for. I'm happy to have it behind me. It is really liberating to realize that it's okay to not live up to other people's expectations of you. So if you haven't had that crisis, I think it can be avoided by just starting to consider what you want for yourself versus what you believe you should want. Anyway, I think a key point that she makes is that when you go through this process, it may make you feel really bitter and like a fool for betraying yourself for so long. We'll definitely feel deceived and maybe even betrayed by people that have hurt us in the past and caused traumas. Like Terri explains, we may identify as a victim and continue to live our past hurts. This is where releasing our past comes in. In my experience, I definitely got really upset and felt incredibly deceived, but I realized that the anger I was carrying was keeping me from healing. I love how she says to change why me to what now. Why me carries an energy of powerlessness, while what now is empowering. Terri said that she let go of the role of the victim and she decided to take on the role of the survivor. This is so important because moving forward, if we identify as a victim, we will continue to find ourselves in situations where we are victimized. Our minds look for opportunities to reinforce our beliefs, or as I have started to refer to them as agreements, because a belief is really just a thought that we choose to agree with. A victim is someone who is continuously victimized. A survivor is someone who was victimized and used the experience to rise above. If we release what actually happened and focus on the lesson we were meant to learn, we can stop the cycle and stop reliving past hurts. The other huge topic that Terri talks about is the ego. Now, this is one of my favorite subjects, and I can go on and on about it, but I won't here. I just want to make sure that you heard that the job of the ego is to keep you alive. It's not rational, and it sees any sort of discomfort as possible death. So we must be super intentional about monitoring the ego and only listening when it's necessary for survival. All growth happens outside of the comfort zone. Let me say that again. All growth happens outside of comfort. Letting our ego run the show does not lead to anywhere worthwhile. Get honest about defense mechanisms that have turned into habits and are seriously holding you back from an exciting and meaningful life that you are truly proud of. Now let's get back to Terri and Stephanie to find out how to connect with Terri, and she even has a free ebook download just for you.
So if someone would like to find out more about your book, or I know you've got a podcast and a website, where could they find more information or connect with you further?
Everything can be found at terrikozlowski.com. The podcast is the soulsolutionspodcast.com. And the book is raventranscendingfear.com, which is also available on Amazon. So you can find all things. I'm across all the social media areas, and they can connect with me. And I will give your audience a free Blueprint to Overcoming Fear, which is a mini ebook to the prequel of Raven Transcending Fear that actually gives you the 6 steps to overcome your fears and limiting beliefs.
Nice. Okay. And how can they get that?
I will give you a link to put in the show notes.
Awesome. Wow. Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you. Well, this has been really a wonderful conversation. I know, we had talked before. I knew quite a bit about your story, but I found out even more today in our discussion. So thank you for being open, for being vulnerable, for practicing what you preach when it comes to that. It was a really enlightening conversation. So thank you again.
You're welcome, Stephanie. It was a pleasure to be with you and your audience today.
If you were inspired by today's guest, be sure to save this episode so you can go back and listen to it again. Making the shift from feeling powerless to empowered is not a quick and easy thing to do, we know, but our desire is that you've gained hope and confidence that it's possible and so worth it. Now, go hit that subscribe or follow button so you don't miss the next episode.